If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you I had the perfect life. My name's Michael, and I'm 37. My wife, Emma, is the same age, and we've been together since our university days. Honestly, Emma was the kind of woman every guy dreams about but never thinks he'll actually meet. She was fun, outgoing, and had this warmth that made everyone around her feel like they belonged. She was the type who could strike up a conversation with a stranger at the supermarket and leave with a new friend by the time she reached the checkout line. I was more reserved, the quiet guy who preferred books to parties and coffee to cocktails. Somehow, though, we just worked. Emma brought me out of my shell, and I grounded her when life got chaotic. We balanced each other in all the right ways. She was my rock, my partner, my best friend. If life was a puzzle, she was the piece that made everything else click. We got married right after graduation. It was a small, intimate ceremony with just close family and friends. She wore this simple lace dress, and when I saw her walking down the aisle, I knew without a doubt I was the luckiest man alive. Over the years, that feeling never wavered. Sure, we had our ups and downs like anyone else, but we always came out stronger. Emma worked at a bank, and she was brilliant at it. Numbers, problem-solving, managing people, she thrived in the fast-paced world of finance. I, on the other hand, opened a small cafe near our house. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and Emma supported me every step of the way. She even helped me design the interior, picking out the quirky decorations and color scheme that made the place feel like home. We had our routines, too. Weekdays were hectic, her job often meant late nights, especially around quarterly report season, and I'd be up early prepping the cafe for the morning rush. But weekends? Those were sacred. Saturday mornings were lazy and slow, with coffee in bed and breakfast at the cafe. Sundays were spent at church, followed by long walks or movie marathons. It was our rhythm, and I loved it. If there was a picture of marital bliss, it would have been us. Or so I thought. Looking back now, those early years of our marriage feel like a dream. Emma and I were the type of couple who made people roll their eyes because we were just that happy. You know the kind, holding hands in public, finishing each other's sentences, laughing until our sides hurt at inside jokes. We were the team everyone wanted to root for, the partners who made you believe in soulmates. When we first got married, money was tight. Emma had just started her job at the bank, and I was still setting up the cafe. We lived in this tiny one-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and a heater that barely worked in the winter. The kitchen was so small that if one of us opened a cabinet, the other had to duck or risk getting smacked in the head. But we didn't care, it was our home, and we loved it. We used to stay up late, huddled under blankets, talking about our future. Emma would dream up these big plans for vacations we couldn't afford yet, like backpacking through Europe or road tripping across the US. I'd talk about all the ways I wanted to grow the cafe, turning it into a place that felt like the heart of the neighborhood. Just you wait, Emma would say with that mischievous smile I loved so much. One day, your cafe is going to be the spot where everyone wants to be. And when that happens, you'll be way too famous for little ol' me. She had this way of making me feel like I could do anything. Like the world was ours to conquer. And in return, I tried to make her feel just as unstoppable. I'd surprise her with little things, notes in her lunchbox, flowers from the corner store, her favorite chocolate bars tucked into her purse when she wasn't looking. But it wasn't just the big, romantic gestures that made those years so special. It was the small, everyday moments that cemented our bond. Cooking dinner together in that cramped kitchen, bumping elbows and laughing as we tried not to burn the garlic bread. Dancing around the living room to whatever song happened to be playing on the radio. Spending Sunday afternoons sprawled on the couch, too comfortable to move, as we argued about which movie to watch. Our families adored us, too. My mom always said Emma was the daughter she never had, and Emma's mom would pull me aside during family gatherings to tell me how lucky her daughter was to have me. Emma's dad, though, well, he wasn't the biggest fan of anyone dating his daughter, but even he eventually warmed up to me. When we weren't working, we'd spend time with our friends, who often joked that we were sickeningly in love. And maybe we were. But we didn't care. We were building a life together, one that felt solid and unshakable. As the years went on, Emma's career took off. She climbed the ranks at the bank, earning promotions and respect from her colleagues. I couldn't have been prouder of her. At the same time, the cafe started to gain traction. What had started as a risky passion project turned into a cozy local hotspot. We were both thriving in our own ways, but we never lost sight of each other. Every success felt like something we'd achieved together. I remember one particular night that perfectly captured how things were back then. Emma had just received a big bonus at work, and I had hit a milestone at the cafe, selling out of my signature pastries for the first time. To celebrate, we decided to go all out. We dressed up, Emma in this stunning blue dress that made her eyes sparkle, me in a suit that didn't quite fit because I'd lost a little weight from all the running around at the cafe, and went to this fancy restaurant downtown. We laughed the whole night, reminiscing about how far we'd come since those early days in our tiny apartment. I held her hand across the table and told her how much I loved her, how I couldn't imagine my life without her. And she looked at me with those warm, honey-colored eyes and said, "I love you too, Michael. Forever." In that moment, I believed her. Wholeheartedly. I thought we had forever. And for years, it really felt like we did. If there was one thing about our life that wasn't picture-perfect, it was Emma's job at the bank. Don't get me wrong, she was amazing at it. Emma had this sharp mind for numbers and a way of making even the most tedious tasks seem easy. Her bosses adored her, her coworkers respected her, and clients would go out of their way to request her help. She was a star, no doubt about it. But there was a cost to her success, and I started to notice it more as the years went by. Working in a bank sounds like a normal 9 to 5, right? Wrong. At least not in Emma's case. The higher she climbed the corporate ladder, the more demanding her job became. Quarterly reports, audits, and late-night meetings became the norm. There were weeks where I'd barely see her during the workweek because she'd leave the house before sunrise and come home well after dark. At first, I didn't mind. I was proud of her, and I knew how much she loved what she did. She'd come home exhausted but still glowing, talking about how she'd solved a tricky problem or helped a client with a complicated financial plan. I'd listen, offer her a cup of tea, and tell her how incredible she was. But as time went on, her work started to take over more and more of our lives. Emma would bring work home with her, literal stacks of paperwork and her laptop. Our evenings, once spent laughing over dinner or curled up on the couch watching our favorite shows, were now silent. She'd be at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration, while I sat in the living room trying not to feel like a third wheel in my own marriage. There were also the calls. Oh, the calls. They came at all hours, early in the morning, late at night, even on weekends. I remember one Sunday morning when we were supposed to be heading to church, and her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and sighed, "I need to take this. It's urgent." I nodded, understanding as always, but when the call stretched into an hour, I went to church alone that day. The worst part, though, was the unpredictability. Emma's schedule was like a ticking time bomb. We'd make plans, dinner dates, weekend getaways, or even just a quiet evening at home, and then, at the last minute, she'd get called into work. "I'm sorry, Michael," she'd say, looking genuinely torn. "Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. It's just this one thing. I promise I'll make it up to you." And she always tried. But some things couldn't be undone. It wasn't just me who noticed, either. My friends would joke about how Emma was married to her job as much as she was married to me. "Does she even know what the cafe looks like anymore?" one of them asked, half laughing, half serious. I'd brush it off, saying she was just really dedicated to her career. But deep down, it stung. I missed her. Then there were the bank events. Oh, those events. Emma would have to attend networking parties and corporate dinners, which sounded glamorous but were really just hours of small talk with people who only cared about business. I'd go with her sometimes, playing the supportive husband, but I always felt out of place. Emma would light up the room, chatting effortlessly with everyone, while I stood in the corner, nursing a drink and waiting for it to be over. And the thing is, I didn't resent her for any of it. I knew how hard she worked and how much it meant to her. But there were moments, quiet, lonely moments, where I couldn't help but wonder if we were slowly drifting apart. Not because we wanted to, but because her work was pulling her in one direction and I was stuck in another. I'd try to talk to her about it, but she'd always reassure me. "It's just a phase," she'd say. "Once this project is over, things will calm down. We'll have more time together, I promise." And I'd believe her because I wanted to believe her. Because I loved her. No matter how chaotic the weekdays got, our weekends were sacred. They were the glue that held us together, the sunshine after the storm of deadlines, reports, and endless coffee-fueled nights. If the workweek was a maze of responsibilities and long hours, our weekends were a wide-open field of possibilities. And we cherished them. Saturday mornings were our ritual. Neither of us set alarms because waking up naturally felt like a luxury after 5 days of rushing out the door. I'd always wake up first, the soft light filtering through the curtains, and just lie there for a moment, listening to Emma breathe beside me. She looked so peaceful in those moments, her face relaxed, free from the stress of her job. Eventually, she'd stir, blinking at me with that sleepy smile I loved so much. "Morning," she'd mumble, her voice still soft from sleep. And just like that, the weight of the week would lift. We'd spend those mornings in bed, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes, we'd plan our day, what errands we needed to run, which cafe we'd try for lunch. Other times, we'd just enjoy the quiet, stealing kisses and laughing at stupid jokes. It felt like the rest of the world didn't exist, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Breakfast was always special on weekends. Instead of my usual grab-and-go toast or her rushed yogurt, we'd make a proper meal together. Pancakes, eggs, fruit, the works. Our tiny kitchen would be filled with the smell of sizzling butter and freshly brewed coffee. Emma loved experimenting with new recipes, and I'd play her sous chef, chopping fruit or flipping pancakes while she danced around the kitchen, humming along to the radio. After breakfast, we'd head to the cafe. Even though it was technically work for me, it never felt that way on Saturdays. Emma would sit in her favorite corner booth with a book or her tablet while I helped the team manage the morning rush. She loved the cafe as much as I did, and I think part of her enjoyed being a little bit of a celebrity there. Customers would wave to her, and regulars would stop by her table to chat. "Your wife is the heart of this place," one of them once told me, and I couldn't have agreed more. Sundays were quieter, but no less special. Church was a big part of our lives, a tradition we'd started when we first got married. It wasn't just about faith for us, it was about community, connection, and taking a moment to reflect. We had our favorite pew near the back, and Emma always made a point to greet everyone with a warm smile. After church, we'd usually grab lunch at a local diner or take a walk through the park near our house. I can still picture Emma strolling along the path, her hair catching the sunlight, her laughter ringing out as she pointed out the dogs passing by or the kids playing on the swings. The afternoons were for us, no plans, no schedules. Sometimes we'd tackle little projects around the house, like reorganizing the bookshelf or planting flowers in the garden. Other times, we'd just collapse on the couch with a stack of movies or binge-watch a new show. We'd argue over what to watch, of course. Emma loved comedies, and I was more into dramas, but it was never serious. By the end of the day, we'd be wrapped up in a blanket together, happy and content. And then there were the little surprises. Emma had this knack for turning an ordinary weekend into something magical. One Saturday, out of nowhere, she announced, "Let's drive to the beach." It was a 2-hour trip, and we had no plan, but that was Emma for you, spontaneous and full of life. We ended up eating seafood by the water, walking along the shore, and watching the sunset. It was perfect. Those weekends were our safe haven, a chance to reconnect and remind ourselves of everything we loved about each other. No matter how tough the week had been, by Sunday night, we always felt like we'd found our way back to each other. If there's one thing Emma and I were consistent about, it was going to church every Sunday. No matter how busy the week had been, no matter how tired we felt, we always made it a priority. It wasn't just about the service, it was about the people, the familiarity, and the chance to reset our minds and hearts for the week ahead. It was something we shared, something that anchored us as a couple. So, when I woke up that Sunday morning feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, I was torn. I'd been battling a cold all week, but that morning, it had turned into a full-blown fever. My head throbbed, my throat was raw, and every muscle in my body ached. "Michael, you're not going," Emma said firmly, her hands on her hips as she stood beside the bed. I tried to protest, of course. "I'll be fine," I croaked, trying to sit up. "I'll take some medicine. It's just a couple of hours." But Emma wasn't having it. "You can barely stand, let alone sit through a service. Stay in bed. I'll go for both of us." She pressed a cool hand to my forehead, her brow furrowing in concern. "You're burning up, Michael. Please, just rest." She was right, of course. As much as I hated to admit it, I was in no shape to leave the house. But missing church felt wrong, like skipping a family gathering or breaking a tradition. "I hate not being there with you," I muttered, sinking back into the pillows. Emma smiled softly, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "You're there in spirit. Don't worry, I'll come straight home after and tell you all about it." With that, she left to get ready. From the bedroom, I could hear her humming as she showered and got dressed. I felt a pang of guilt for not going with her, but there was also a strange sense of comfort in hearing those familiar sounds. It reminded me of how much I loved our routine, how much I loved her. When Emma came back to check on me before leaving, she looked radiant in her Sunday dress. She leaned down, brushing my hair back from my face. "Stay in bed, okay? I'll bring you soup when I get back. Don't forget to say hi to everyone for me," I said weakly, managing a small smile. "I will. Love you." "Love you too," I whispered as she walked out the door. For most of the day, I drifted in and out of sleep, the fever making time feel like it was moving in slow motion. I imagined Emma at church, her warm smile lighting up the room as she greeted the congregation. I pictured her chatting with Mrs. Henderson about her garden or laughing with Mr. Phillips about some story he'd tell for the 100th time. It was comforting, in a way, to know she was there even if I couldn't be. But as the hours passed, I started to notice how late it was getting. By mid-afternoon, Emma still wasn't home. I figured maybe she'd stayed after the service to catch up with someone or help with something at the church. She was like that, always willing to lend a hand or an ear. When the sun began to set, I started to feel uneasy. Emma wasn't the type to be gone for so long without at least checking in. I grabbed my phone to text her, but before I could, the front door opened. She walked in, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her smile bright but different. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her purse down. "I ran into some old friends at church, and we ended up walking around the city and catching up." I nodded, brushing off the odd feeling that stirred in my chest. Of course, it made sense. Emma was social, and people loved her. Still, something about the way she said it felt off. But I told myself I was overthinking. That night, as I lay in bed recovering, I was just grateful she was home. Grateful that she'd had a good day, even if I hadn't been able to share it with her. Something changed after that Sunday. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things that didn't feel quite right. Emma seemed distracted, her warmth replaced by something cooler, more distant. The woman who used to come home and share every detail of her day suddenly had less to say. "How was work?" I'd ask as she came through the door. "Fine," she'd reply, her tone flat as she tossed her bag onto the couch. I brushed it off at first. Everyone has off days, right? Maybe she was just tired. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us grew. Emma started working late even more often than usual. She'd come home exhausted, barely looking at me as she muttered something about reports or deadlines. When she was home, she spent most of her time glued to her phone, her screen lighting up with messages she'd quickly swipe away if I got too close. "Who's that?" I asked casually one evening, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Just work stuff," she said quickly, slipping her phone into her pocket. It wasn't just the late nights or the secrecy, it was her demeanor. Emma used to be so affectionate, always finding little ways to show she cared. A kiss on the cheek as she passed by, a hand on my shoulder as we watched TV. But now, those moments were few and far between. I started second-guessing everything. Was I imagining things? Was she just stressed? Or was there something more? I didn't want to believe the worst, but the knot in my stomach refused to go away. Even our weekends, once our sacred time together, felt different. She'd still go to church, but she'd leave earlier and come back later. When I suggested we go for a walk or have brunch at the cafe, she'd come up with excuses: too tired, too much to do, maybe another time. I felt like I was losing her, and I didn't know how to stop it. A month after that Sunday, Emma surprised me. "Let's go away for a few days," she said one evening as we sat in awkward silence. "Just us. We need it." Her words felt like a lifeline, and I grabbed onto them with both hands. "Where do you want to go?" "Anywhere," she said, her smile almost reaching her eyes. "Somewhere quiet, relaxing." We ended up booking a cabin in the mountains, a cozy little place surrounded by trees and trails. It was the perfect escape. No work, no phones, no distractions. Just us. As soon as we arrived, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The air was crisp, the view was breathtaking, and for the first time in weeks, Emma seemed like herself again. We spent our days hiking, exploring the trails hand in hand, laughing at how out of shape we were as we gasped for breath on the steeper climbs. At night, we'd sit by the fire, sharing stories and sipping hot chocolate like we used to. One evening, as we watched the stars from the cabin's porch, Emma leaned her head on my shoulder. "I've missed this," she said softly. "Me too," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "I've missed you." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "I'm sorry if I've been distant. Work's just been a lot lately." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. So I nodded, wrapping my arm around her. "It's okay. We're okay." For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. That vacation felt like a reset button, a chance to start fresh. Emma seemed happier, lighter, and so was I. As we packed up to head home, I told myself that whatever had been causing the strain was behind us. We'd turned a corner, and things would only get better from here. Coming back from that mountain getaway, I was optimistic, maybe even a little too much so. Emma and I had reconnected in a way that made me feel like we'd weathered the storm. The warmth was back in her smile, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I thought we'd turned the page, leaving whatever tension we'd been feeling firmly in the past. But reality has a way of creeping back in, doesn't it? The first week back felt like a dream. Emma was affectionate again, kissing me goodbye in the mornings and texting me sweet little notes during the day. She even came to the cafe one afternoon, surprising me with lunch and sitting in her usual corner booth like she used to. "Looks like you're finally getting some free time," I teased, setting down her latte. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I told you, things are getting better." I clung to those words like a lifeline. For a while, it seemed like she was right. Emma wasn't working as late, and when she did stay late, she'd call to check in or let me know she'd be home soon. She even suggested we start having dinner together more often, something we hadn't done consistently in months. But then, the cracks started to show again. It was little things at first. She'd glance at her phone during dinner, her fingers tapping out quick messages with a half-hearted, "Sorry, it's work." Her late nights started creeping back into the routine. One night, she came home well past midnight, claiming there'd been a last-minute meeting. "I thought things were getting better?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "They are," she said quickly, brushing past me to hang up her coat. "This was just a one-off. Don't worry." But I was worried. The following weekend, I suggested we skip church and spend the morning together instead, just the two of us. "Let's have breakfast at the cafe, maybe take a walk through the park," I offered. Emma hesitated, her smile faltering. "I can't miss church," she said, almost too quickly. I promised I'd help out with something. "What kind of something?" I asked, trying not to sound suspicious. "Just organizing some materials for the next service. It's no big deal." She kissed my cheek and grabbed her bag. "I'll be back before lunch." She wasn't. When she finally came home that afternoon, she was cheerful, almost too cheerful. She started rambling about how great the service was, how she'd run into a few people we knew. It felt rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to convince me everything was fine. "Why don't we go together next week?" I suggested. Her smile tightened. "Of course. Next week." Something was wrong. I could feel it. But every time I tried to bring it up, Emma deflected, insisting that I was overthinking things. I wanted to trust her, I did trust her. But there was a voice in the back of my mind, whispering that something wasn't adding up. It was the way her phone seemed permanently glued to her hand, the way she'd lock the screen whenever I walked into the room. It was the vague excuses, the lingering sense that she was keeping something from me. I told myself I was imagining it. That the vacation had fixed everything, that Emma was just stressed again. But deep down, I knew better. The next 2 months were a roller coaster. One day, it felt like Emma and I were back to being the couple we'd always been, laughing over coffee in the mornings, stealing kisses in the kitchen, making plans for the weekend. The next, she'd be distant again, wrapped up in her own world and brushing off any attempts I made to connect. It was exhausting, to say the least. One weekend, out of nowhere, Emma suggested a date night. "Let's go to that Italian place you love," she said with a smile that almost felt like an apology. "We haven't gone out in ages." I jumped at the idea, desperate for some normalcy. And for a while, it worked. Sitting across from her in the warm glow of the restaurant, sharing a bottle of wine and trading stories about our week, I started to feel like things were okay again. But then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her smile faltering for a split second before she tucked it back into her purse. "Sorry about that," she said, but the moment was already gone. Later that week, she came home late again, later than usual. I'd made dinner, a small effort to surprise her and maybe carve out some time together, but by the time she walked through the door, the food was cold, and my frustration was simmering just under the surface. "I told you I'd be late," she said defensively when I asked what had kept her. "No, you didn't," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Michael, I can't keep explaining myself every time work runs over. Can't you just trust me?" Trust. The word hung in the air like a challenge. It wasn't just the late nights or the vague excuses, it was the inconsistency. One moment, she'd be fully present, wrapping her arms around me and whispering that she loved me. The next, she'd be miles away, physically there but emotionally absent. I tried to talk to her about it, but every conversation ended the same way, with her brushing it off as work stress or turning the tables and asking why I was so suspicious. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. Why can't you just let it go? She asked one night, her voice tinged with exasperation. Because I feel like I'm losing you, I admitted, the words catching in my throat. Emma's face softened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to open up. But then she just shook her head and said, "You're not losing me, Michael. I'm right here." But she wasn't. The swings in our relationship were dizzying. One week, she'd come home early, surprising me with dinner or suggesting we watch one of our favorite movies. The next, she'd barely acknowledge me, her attention focused entirely on her phone or whatever work she'd brought home. I started overcompensating, trying to bridge the gap with grand gestures, flowers, spontaneous dates, even a weekend trip I planned to one of her favorite spots. And for a little while, it seemed to help. She'd smile more, laugh more, hold my hand like she used to. But it never lasted. The cracks in our relationship were growing, and no amount of effort on my part seemed to fill them. There was a weight hanging between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us could name, or maybe just that I couldn't name. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. The late nights, the secrecy, the way she seemed to light up when she thought I wasn't looking, it all pointed to something I didn't want to believe. But I told myself it would pass. That whatever this was, we'd get through it together. It happened on a Sunday, a few months after everything had started to unravel. We'd gone to church together that morning, just like we used to. It had been one of those rare weeks where Emma seemed like her old self, kind, attentive, laughing at my jokes. For the first time in a while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. After the service, Emma stayed behind to talk with the head priest. He was a warm, charismatic man who everyone in the congregation admired. I didn't think much of it, she often stayed back to help with small tasks or chat with people from the church. "I'll wait for you outside," I said, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. She nodded, smiling in that soft, familiar way. "I won't be long." It wasn't until we got home later that day that I realized I'd left my wallet behind. I'd taken it out during the service to put money in the offering plate and must have left it on the pew. "Don't worry," Emma said when I mentioned it. "I'm sure it's still there. Everyone knows us, someone would have picked it up." I decided I'd stop by the church the next morning to look for it. After all, it was just a 5-minute drive from the house, and I figured the priest or one of the staff would have found it by then. The next morning, I headed to the church, feeling strangely at ease. It was quiet when I arrived, the large wooden doors slightly ajar. The stillness inside was comforting, the kind of peace I'd always loved about that place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty pews. There was no response. I made my way down the aisle, scanning the seats for any sign of my wallet. I didn't see it, but I wasn't worried. The priest's office was just down the hall, if someone had found it, that's where it would be. As I approached the office, I heard voices. One of them was Emma's. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. Why was she here? She'd left for work earlier that morning, hadn't she? I inched closer, the words becoming clearer. It wasn't just Emma's voice, it was the priest's too. "Are you sure this is safe?" I heard her say, her tone nervous but excited. "Relax," the priest replied, his voice low and reassuring. "No one comes here at this time." I don't know what compelled me to keep moving, but I did. Step by step, until I was standing just outside the office door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw them. My wife. The head priest. both of them half-dressed, locked in an embrace that turned my stomach. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Emma, my Emma, standing there with another man, here, of all places. Someone could come in, Emma whispered, pulling back slightly. Let them, the priest said with a smirk, pulling her closer. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, the need for proof overriding the chaos in my head. I hit record, my heart pounding as I captured the betrayal unfolding before me. For a moment, I thought about bursting in, confronting them right then and there. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as everything I thought I knew about my life shattered into pieces. Finally, I turned and walked out, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They hadn't even noticed I was there. That evening, when Emma came home, I was waiting. Her suitcase was packed, sitting by the door. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. I looked her in the eye, my voice cold and steady. "I know, Emma. I know everything." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. "Michael, I can explain." "No," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to lie to me anymore." Her excuses, her tears, her apologies, none of it mattered. I didn't give her a chance to say much more before I told her to leave. And as she walked out the door, all I could think about was how the woman I'd built my life around had burned it to the ground in the place we'd once called holy. The night Emma left felt like the longest of my life. I sat in the silence of our house, staring at the packed suitcase she hadn't taken. My mind was racing, replaying the scene in the church over and over again. Every moment felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, laughing with him, leaning into his touch, a version of Emma I didn't recognize. How could she do this? How could she betray me, betray us, in such a devastating way? By morning, I knew what I had to do. I took the video I'd recorded and sent it anonymously to a few people in our church community. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but the truth needed to come out. This wasn't just about Emma, this was about the head priest, a man everyone trusted, breaking that trust in the worst possible way. It didn't take long for the video to spread. By the end of the day, everyone in the congregation knew. It was the talk of the town, and the backlash was swift. The priest resigned immediately, and Emma's name was dragged through every conversation and social media post. I thought I'd feel vindicated, but all I felt was empty. Over the next few days, Emma tried to reach out to me. She called, texted, even showed up at the cafe once, pleading with me to let her explain. "There's nothing to explain," I told her, my voice devoid of emotion. "You made your choices. Now live with them." She cried, begged for forgiveness, told me it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant for any of it to happen. But I couldn't listen. Every word she said felt hollow, like an insult to the years we'd spent building our life together. "Why, Emma?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "It just happened. I was feeling lost, and he listened." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't blame this on being lost. You had me. I was right here, Emma. I would have listened. I did listen. But you chose him. You chose to destroy everything we had." She didn't have a response to that. She just nodded, her shoulders slumping as she turned and walked away. The divorce was quick. I made sure of that. I emptied our joint account, leaving her just enough to get by, and filed the papers within a week. I didn't want anything to do with her anymore. Our families were devastated. My parents, who had adored Emma like their own daughter, were heartbroken. Her mother, who had always been so supportive of our marriage, called me in tears, apologizing for what her daughter had done. "Don't blame yourself," I told her. "This isn't on you." But even as I tried to move on, the pain lingered. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the loss of the life I thought we'd have together. The plans we'd made, the memories we'd shared, the future I'd imagined, all of it was gone. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference. For months, I couldn't step foot in the church. Every time I drove past it, my chest tightened, and I had to look away. It wasn't just a place of worship anymore, it was the site of my greatest heartbreak. And yet, life goes on. Slowly, painfully, but it does. 3 years later, I'm remarried to someone who truly loves and respects me, someone who makes me feel whole again. The cafe is thriving, and for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. As for Emma, she never found a permanent partner. Her reputation followed her, and no one wanted to take the risk. I hear about her sometimes through mutual friends, how she's still trying to rebuild her life, how she's never been the same since we parted ways. And while part of me still aches for what we lost, another part of me is grateful. Because that day in the church, as painful as it was, set me free. It taught me to value myself, to demand honesty and respect in my relationships. After the divorce, life became a blur of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, they all came in waves, leaving me unsure if I'd ever feel normal again. The house felt like a hollow shell, the echoes of a life I once loved haunting every room. There were nights when I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chair Emma used to sit in, wondering how everything had unraveled so completely. But life doesn't stop just because your heart is broken. Slowly, I began to rebuild. The cafe became my sanctuary. Pouring myself into my work gave me a sense of purpose, something to focus on besides the gaping hole Emma had left behind. My customers, who had always been more like family, were there for me in ways I never expected. They'd stop by not just for coffee but to check in, to offer kind words or a listening ear. "Keep going, Michael," one regular told me. "The best days are still ahead." At first, I didn't believe them. But with time, I started to see glimpses of hope. The cafe began to thrive in a way it never had before, becoming a true cornerstone of the community. It was a reminder that even when everything else feels uncertain, you can still create something good. As for Emma, her life took a very different turn. In the weeks following the divorce, her name was on everyone's lips. The video of her and the priest spread quickly, and while I didn't revel in the fallout, I couldn't deny the justice in it. The priest resigned in disgrace, and Emma became a cautionary tale in our small community. She moved out of town shortly after, unable to bear the weight of the judgment and whispers that followed her everywhere she went. I heard through mutual friends that she tried to start fresh in a new city, but the stigma of what she'd done seemed to follow her like a shadow. Over the years, she reached out a few times. Emails, a letter, even a message through one of my friends. She apologized, over and over, saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life and would give anything to undo it. But by then, I had nothing left to give her. The head priest, who'd once been admired by the congregation, didn't fare much better. The scandal cost him his position, his reputation, and many of the relationships he'd built over the years. Last I heard, he was living a quiet, solitary life, far from the community he once led. The strange thing is, I don't feel hatred toward him anymore. At first, I did. I hated him with every fiber of my being. But as time went on, I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. So, I let it go. As for me, life eventually found its rhythm again. About 2 years after the divorce, I met Claire, a woman who was everything I didn't know I needed. She was kind, patient, and had this quiet strength that drew me in. She didn't try to fix me, she simply walked beside me as I put myself back together. We got married last year in a small, beautiful ceremony. It wasn't the grand event my wedding with Emma had been, but it felt more real, more grounded. Claire and I have built a life based on trust and respect, and for that, I'm endlessly grateful. But every now and then, Emma's name still comes up. She never really recovered, a mutual friend told me not long ago. She's been in and out of relationships, but nothing seems to stick. I think she's still carrying a lot of guilt. I don't wish her ill, I really don't. If anything, I hope she finds peace one day. But I also know that peace is something she has to find for herself. Looking back now, I see the whole experience as a strange kind of blessing. It's taught me the value of boundaries, the importance of self-respect, and the strength it takes to walk away from something, even when it breaks your heart. Life moves on, whether you're ready for it or not. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it moves on to something better. Claire and I are expecting our first child in a few months, and I've never been happier. The cafe is thriving, my relationships with family and friends are stronger than ever, and for the first time in years, I feel whole. As for Emma, I hope she's found something to hold on to, something that gives her life meaning. We all make mistakes, some bigger than others. But life isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about what you do after you've made them. And as for me, I choose to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Support the channel by subscribing, it really makes a difference.